She said I was suffocating her. But what I found in her car changed everything. At 47, I thought I understood betrayal. I'd seen friends go through divorces, watched colleagues get backstabbed at work, heard countless stories of broken trust. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the message that appeared on my phone that Tuesday morning. When Charlotte texted, "I'm not your property," I felt my entire world tilt on its axis. I stared at those 4 words until they burned into my retinas, not out of rage, but out of something far more profound, a kind of disbelief so complete it felt like I was reading a stranger's message on someone else's phone. This was the woman who, just 5 years ago, had whispered in my ear that I was her oxygen, that without me she simply couldn't exist. The same woman who had collapsed into my arms with joy the afternoon we got the keys to our first real home together, a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Portland. And now, out of nowhere, she was addressing me like I was some kind of oppressor, some controlling figure she needed to declare her independence from. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely type my response. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, a place I didn't even know existed. "And you're no longer my wife." The moment I hit send, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. It was pain and peace existing in the same breath, fighting for dominance in my chest. They say the truth will set you free, but they never mention how much it costs. 15 minutes crawled by like 15 hours. Then my phone screen lit up with her name, incoming call, Charlotte. My finger hovered over the answer button, frozen in indecision. Part of me desperately wanted to hear her voice, to have her explain everything away with some reasonable explanation that would make all of this a terrible misunderstanding. But another part of me, the part that had been slowly dying over the past 8 months, knew that answering would only drag me back into a cycle I'd been trapped in for far too long. Every ring felt like a fishhook pulling at my heart, yanking me backward through an endless timeline of emotional decay. The distance between us hadn't appeared overnight like a sudden storm. No, it had crept in gradually, almost imperceptibly, like water slowly eroding stone. First came the skipped dinners, then the excuses that started to sound rehearsed. "I'm exhausted, Marcus," she'd say, barely looking up from her phone. "It's just been such a stressful week at work." And I believed her. God help me, I believed every single word because I wanted to, because I needed to. I thought that's what love meant, that beautiful combination of patience, understanding, and unconditional forgiveness. What I failed to grasp, what nobody tells you about love, is that it also requires honesty, and Charlotte had stopped offering me that precious commodity months and months ago. There was this one night, probably 6 months before everything finally shattered. I'd come home from my shift at the engineering firm earlier than usual because a client meeting had been canceled. The house was dim, just the glow from her laptop casting bluish shadows across our living room. She was on the couch, completely absorbed in whatever was on her screen, and as I walked in, I saw a message notification pop up in the corner. The preview was brief, but it was enough. "I wish you were here instead of him." 7 words that detonated like a bomb in my chest. I remember standing there in the doorway, my briefcase still in my hand, watching that message fade from the screen as it locked automatically. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. My chest felt like someone had reached inside and was squeezing my lungs. And yet, incredibly, stupidly, I said nothing. Not a single word. I just stood there in that dim room, silently watching the woman I'd built my entire adult life around disappear behind a carefully constructed wall of lies and whispered phone calls that she claimed were all about work emergencies. The coward in me hoped it would all just go away if I ignored it. The lover in me couldn't bear to confront what I already knew deep down. When I finally gathered the courage to confront her, it was 3 weeks later, after I'd found hotel receipts in her car and noticed charges on her credit card statement for restaurants we'd never been to together. I'd rehearse what I would say 100 times, tried to imagine every possible explanation she might give, prepared myself to listen and understand. But when I finally sat her down at our kitchen table, when I finally asked her directly about what had been happening, she didn't even have the decency to deny it. She didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't even look particularly surprised that I'd figured it out. She just sighed, this deep, exasperated sigh like I was a child who'd asked an annoying question, and rolled her eyes before delivering the words that would haunt me for months. "You're suffocating me, Marcus. You don't own me. I need space to be myself." I wanted to scream at her that I'd never wanted to own her, that ownership had nothing to do with what I felt. I only wanted to be loved by her, to be chosen by her, to matter to her the way she'd once mattered to me. But she didn't want to hear any of that. She'd already mentally checked out of our marriage, already rewritten our entire history in her mind until I became the villain of a story where she was the victim fighting for her freedom. The words she kept using, distance, control, independence, autonomy, they all sounded so noble, so righteous, so justified. But underneath that noble language, I could smell the rot of betrayal, the stench of deceit, the bitter taste of someone rewriting reality to justify what they wanted to do anyway. That's why when her text arrived that morning, "I'm not your property," I didn't hesitate even for a second before responding. "And you're no longer my wife." The silence that followed that message felt heavier than every argument we'd ever had combined, heavier than the weight of all those months of pretending everything was fine. My phone screen dimmed to black. The room fell into a quiet so complete I could hear the wall clock in the hallway, that steady, mocking, endless ticking that seemed to be counting down to something, though I didn't know what. Then, one by one, the notifications began rolling in like a tsunami. 1 missed call, 3 missed calls, 7 missed calls, 15 missed calls in less than an hour, her name flashing over and over again on my screen like a ghost that refused to fade into the darkness where it belonged. But I didn't answer, not once. Not because I wanted to punish her or make her suffer, though perhaps some small, wounded part of me did. I didn't answer because I'd finally realized something that should have been obvious years ago. Every single time I picked up her call, every time I responded to her messages, every time I gave in and tried to fix things, I lost a little more of myself. Piece by piece, I'd been disappearing, and I hadn't even noticed until there was almost nothing left. Charlotte had become a master at a very specific form of control, one that never required raising her voice or making demands. She'd perfected the art of withdrawal. She'd simply pull away emotionally, become distant and cold, and then wait for me to chase her with apologies for things I hadn't done, with explanations for behaviors I hadn't exhibited, with promises to change aspects of myself that were never actually the problem. It was always me bending, me compromising, me trying desperately to make her happy, me attempting to fix us while she observed from a comfortable distance, playing the role of the injured party who just needed more understanding, more space, more freedom. That's how I lost myself. Not suddenly in one catastrophic moment, but slowly, quietly, steadily, all in the name of love, or what I'd been conditioned to believe was love. I walked into our kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands still shaking slightly as I tried to steady both my thoughts and my breathing. The reflection staring back at me from the kitchen window didn't look familiar anymore. The man I saw looked utterly exhausted, but not from lack of sleep. No, this was something far deeper. This was years of emotional exhaustion, years of carrying the weight of a relationship on my shoulders alone, years of making excuses for someone who'd stopped caring. The truth I'd been avoiding crashed over me with brutal clarity. I had been living in absolute denial. Every sarcastic comment that cut just a little too deep, every cold glance that lasted a moment too long, every night she turned away from me in bed claiming she was too tired, I had justified it all. "It's just a phase," I'd tell myself while staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. "Every marriage goes through rough patches. This will passive, but the phase never ended." The rough patch became our permanent reality, and I just kept making excuses, kept hoping, kept believing that if I was just patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, we'd somehow find our way back to what we used to have. Her 15th call came right as I sat down at the kitchen table. I watched my phone vibrate and light up, watched her name flash across the screen, and I let it ring until it finally stopped. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Then came the text message, and I knew without even reading it what it would say because I'd seen this pattern before. "Marcus, please pick up. It's not what you think." The exact same line she'd used 7 months ago when I discovered she'd been texting her coworker, someone named Derek, late into the night, messages that went on until 2 and 3 in the morning. Back then, when I'd confronted her about it, she'd assured me they were just friends, that I was overreacting, that my jealousy was unattractive and unfounded. Like a fool, I'd believed her. I'd told myself that maybe I was being paranoid, that maybe I was letting my insecurities get the better of me, that surely friends could text each other whenever they wanted. But that lie didn't age well, did it? Because friends don't send each other heart emojis at midnight. Friends don't meet in hotel lobbies after supposed late work meetings. Friends don't say things like, "I wish you were here instead of him." I finally turned my phone face down on the table and spoke out loud to the empty kitchen, my voice sounding strange in the silence. No more. Not this time. I wasn't going to let her rewrite our story again. Wasn't going to let her twist and manipulate the narrative until somehow, impossibly, I became the villain while she played the victim. I had been the one who stayed when things got difficult. I had been the one who tried, who begged, who pleaded for us to heal, to get counseling, to work on our marriage. And yet in her version of events, in the story she'd tell her friends and family, I was the controlling one, the suffocating one, the one who didn't understand her need for independence. The injustice of it burned in my throat like acid. As the hours crawled by, the missed calls eventually stopped coming. The silence returned, but this time it felt fundamentally different. It was the kind of silence that comes after a violent storm has finally passed, when all the broken branches lie still on the ground and you can finally assess the damage, finally see what remains and what's been destroyed forever. The quiet felt almost liberating, like I'd been holding my breath underwater for months and had finally broken through the surface. The next morning, weak sunlight crept through the blinds, painting long rectangular lines across our bed, across the side where she used to sleep. Her side remained untouched, the pillow still cold and perfectly positioned, the blanket still folded exactly as she'd left it 3 days ago when she'd said she needed time to think and went to stay with her sister. I stared at that empty space for a long while, and something profound occurred to me. Love doesn't always end with shouting matches or dramatically slammed doors or theatrical confrontations. Sometimes, maybe even most times, it ends quietly, gently, almost politely, with a single text message that finally closes the book on every unfinished sentence between two people who once promised forever. Around noon, there was a firm knock on the front door. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. I could sense her presence, that familiar combination of her perfume mixed with something else, maybe guilt, maybe desperation. I could hear that nervous shifting of feet on the porch, that subtle movement that told me she'd been standing there for a minute, gathering courage. When I finally opened the door, Charlotte stood there looking smaller than I remembered, her eyes swollen and red, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. "You didn't answer," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the tone of a lost child who'd wandered too far from home. I didn't reply immediately. I just looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in months, waiting for her to continue, waiting to see what script she'd prepared for this moment. She took a shaky breath, and I watched her struggle to find words that might undo what couldn't be undone. "I didn't mean it like that," she finally said, her voice cracking slightly. "I was angry. I just wanted some space, that's all." I gave a short laugh, completely devoid of humor, a sound that surprised even me with its bitterness. "Space?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us. "Charlotte, you've had space for months. You've built an entire world without me in it. You've created a whole separate life that I'm not part of." She looked away, unable to meet my eyes, and I watched the guilt paint her face pale, watched her realize that her usual tactics weren't going to work this time. "It wasn't what you think," she whispered again, falling back on that familiar refrain, but this time her voice cracked under the crushing weight of her own lie. I could hear that she didn't even believe it herself anymore. I stepped aside and gestured for her to come in, not because I'd forgiven her, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because some conversations deserve to happen face to face, because closure requires presence. She walked into our house like a stranger visiting a museum of memories, her fingers trailing across picture frames, touching the furniture we'd picked out together, running her hand along the life she'd been systematically abandoning. "I thought you'd always wait for me," she finally said, tears beginning to glisten in her eyes, her voice taking on that particular quality of someone who just realized they'd miscalculated badly. I shook my head slowly, feeling a strange calmness settle over me. "I did wait for you, Charlotte, for far too long. But at some point, waiting stopped being love and started being self-destruction. Waiting became surviving, and surviving isn't love. It's just existing in pain. She reached for my hand, that familiar gesture that had once melted my resolve 1,000 times before. But this time I stepped back, maintaining the distance that had become more emotional than physical. The space between us wasn't measured in inches or feet anymore. It was carved deep into every unspoken truth. Every night she'd chosen her phone over me, every time she'd made me feel like I was a burden instead of a partner, every moment she'd gaslit me into believing I was the problem when she was the one checking out. When she realized I wasn't going to touch her, wasn't going to comfort her, wasn't going to fall back into the old pattern, her tears fell freely, streaming down her cheeks and checked. "So that's it?" she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "You're really done? After everything we've been through, after all these years, you're just giving up?" I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle into my bones, feeling its rightness despite its pain. "You said you're not my property," I reminded her quietly but firmly. "You were absolutely right about that. And I'm not your option, not your backup plan, not your safety net while you explore whatever else is out there. There's nothing left to say after that, Charlotte. You made your choice months ago. I'm just finally accepting it." There was nothing more to discuss after that. No words that could bridge the canyon that had opened between us. She left quietly, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. And this time I didn't watch her walk away. I didn't stand at the window like I had so many times before, hoping she'd turn around, hoping she'd come back, hoping things would somehow magically be different. This time, I simply sat down on our couch, exhaled deeply, and felt something wash over me that I hadn't experienced in years, genuine, profound peace. Later that evening, as the sun set and painted the living room in shades of orange and gold, I opened my phone and scrolled to her contact. My finger hovered over her name for just a moment, taking in all those thousands of messages, all those hours of phone calls, all that history compressed into a digital record. Then I deleted it completely. Her number, her messages, her contact information, all of it gone. As I was about to close my phone, I noticed one last text she'd sent, probably right after she'd left. "Can we talk one last time? Please?" I didn't reply. Some stories don't need another chapter, don't need one more conversation, don't need one final attempt to explain or justify or make sense of what happened. They just need an ending. Clean, final, honest. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to simply let the story end and walk away from the ruins with whatever dignity you have left. At 47, I'd finally learned that lesson. The hard way, perhaps, but learned nonetheless. And as I sat there in the fading light, I realized that while I'd lost a wife, I'd found something far more valuable. I'd found myself again.